In Nebraska, a massive explosion devastates a rural town.
The hotel, it looked like a war zone. There was just concrete all over the streets.
I could hear the screaming from inside. There's nothing you can do to help them.
In Canada, catastrophe strikes a lakeside community.
And then the explosion happened. Everything burned right to the lake, and the lake was on fire.
Disaster takes down a vital highway bridge in Tennessee.
Never dreamed of coming up on anything like that. It was just catastrophic.
And in Australia, a Christmas Eve celebration turns into a nightmare.
People heard loud bangs and thought they were bombs.
With big builds, even the smallest fail can trigger a huge disaster. From miscalculations to misunderstandings, or just plain bad luck. These catastrophes are every engineer's worst nightmare. In massive engineering, every part, no matter how small, is vital. If just one piece goes awry, the results can be catastrophic. Like this disaster in Nebraska, as an explosion ripped through the heart of small-town America.
The whole station just shook when that explosion went off.
The blast hurled massive chunks of concrete across the street.
With a luxury hotel reduced to ruins.
There were flames shooting out most of the windows, and the smoke could be seen for 15, 20 miles away.
Fremont, Nebraska, is a small Midwestern city that has long epitomized the state's slogan, Nebraska Nice. Photojournalist John Haxby has worked the city beat for years.
People are friendly here in town. Everybody wants to meet and greet and talk with you, but that's Nebraska.
The city's friendly welcome goes back more than 150 years.
Fremont thrived as an important station for the railroad heading west, and in the early days of the car was a popular layover for one of the first coast-to-coast roads, the Lincoln Highway.
From 1917, the place to be was the 6-story Pathfinder Hotel, now sadly long gone. Marla Cohn worked at the luxury hotel's pharmacy.
It was a community place for a lot of people. There were weddings and receptions and a little coffee shop, a barber shop, and the Brown Drug Store, which is where I worked.
Everybody would come there, and up until the 60s and 70s, that was the place to go.
For decades, the luxurious hotel hosted everyone from families to big events, even US presidents.
President John F. Kennedy, our 35th president, actually stayed there, as well as other famous people.
But in the winter of 1976, this structure's remarkable story would come to a sudden end. January the 10th, on a cold Saturday morning, a strange smell in the Pathfinder Hotel was bothering guests and staff, like Marla Cohn.
I came to work that day at 9 o'clock. I walked in, at first I'm like, well, the building's old, it kind of smelled funny. So to me, it wasn't, that super abnormal.
Marla might not have been overly concerned, but the smell had others seriously worried.
Before you know it, they were like, we need to evacuate. So I went to grab my coat and my purse. It was freezing out that day, very, very cold. And the next thing, there was the explosion.
At 9:30 a.m., a blast ripped through the Pathfinder, hurling debris across the street. A firefighter at the time, Don Sawyer, was on call.
I was cleaning the window in the front of the fire station. The whole station just shook. You could feel the concussion, and right away the captain knew we had a problem.
Don and his team headed to the scene, as did journalist John Haxby. They arrived to an inferno.
The smoke could be seen for 15, 20 miles away. There were flames shooting out most of the windows.
The hotel, it looked like a war zone. There was concrete all over the streets, there's smoke and fire coming out of the building.
Inside, 2 whole floors had collapsed into the basement, taking Marla down with them.
I realized I had fallen through the floor, and I was down there just basically in a pile of rubble and cement. I could hear people up above, and they're like, we need to get her out of there because this could go again.
Marla was rescued from the rubble, but on the top floor, others were still trapped.
There were some survivors that were up there. They were on the other side of the hotel where they could get some fresh air out of the room.
The thing that I remember most, I could hear the screaming from inside. There's nothing you can do to help them.
People were all over just trying to help and see what they could do.
Nearly 5 hours after the blast, the fire was finally extinguished, along with the fear of another explosion.
We've had some large fires, but this was the biggest thing that ever happened to me.
Of the nearly 70 people in the hotel, more than 40 were injured in the blast, but tragically, 20 others had lost their lives.
It was awful. It was really tough just knowing everybody here. The people that you saw in church every week. You know, you go out to the grocery store, you run into them, and when you lose somebody, you take that to heart, because this is family.
There were a lot of special people that lost their lives. Mothers, fathers, aunts, uncles, sisters. A lot of people did say to me, you're one of the lucky ones.
As the city mourned, the obvious question was, why had this cold Saturday morning turned into a tragedy? In the wake of the disaster, the authorities launched an investigation. The first clues came from survivors like Marla, who knew that the hotel had recently switched heating fuel from oil to gas.
They had been using oil at the hotel prior to that because it was so cold and they wanted to save the gas, the energy for other businesses and homes and everything, and that they had just been given the go-ahead to start using their gas again.
The unusual smell that prompted the evacuation had been a chemical added to the natural gas for this very reason. Chemical engineer J. Patrick Abulencia explains.
Natural gas is typically odorless and colorless. So what they typically do is they add an odorizer, which allows people to smell it if there's ever a gas leak.
The odorizer is a chemical called methyl mercaptan. It smells of rotten eggs so that people realize there's a leak and want to get away from the danger.
When investigators unearthed the gas main, they discovered the source of the blast hidden underground. The connection between 2 gas lines that fed the hotel.
Now, what happened is that there was a coupling that connected a 4-inch pipe to a 2-inch pipe. So the 4-inch pipe was manufactured by one company, and then the 2-inch pipe was manufactured by a different company. Now, when you have 2 different setups on a pipe, when you try to connect the 2, sometimes they don't take into account the design features of each side.
Not only were they made by 2 different companies, the pipes were also made from 2 different materials.
The bigger gas pipe was made from steel. The small one was made from polyethylene, which is widely used to carry gas because it's resistant to sparks.
But the steel and plastic reacted differently to the cold January weather, which presented a problem, particularly where the 2 pipes were connected.
Because of the cold weather that was occurring that particular day, the 2-inch pipe contracted and the pipe coupling fell apart. So because of this contraction, the gas was allowed to escape.
The leak started deep underground, and the gas was escaping into a wall cavity in the hotel's foundations. so no one knew how long it had been building up.
If gas accumulates within a confined space, within a certain amount of volume, typically 5 to 15%, then the natural gas has the ability to combust and explode.
Here, investigators estimated that the cavity was 100% filled with natural gas. All it needed was a spark. But with the evidence destroyed, locating the source of ignition was impossible. In the aftermath of the explosion, regulations were changed regarding how gas pipes are connected. And today, old steel gas lines are being replaced with all plastic, which helps ensure a more reliable connection.
So when you have plastic pipe, the way they connect the pipe these days is that they'll put an adhesive between and you use a little bit of heat to allow the two pipes to connect.
When plastic pipes are glued together, the chemical bond means they effectively act like one structure. And you have the added benefit that plastic is flexible too.
While rule changes and new technology will save lives, decades later, Fremont still remembers the disaster that took so many.
A couple weeks after that happened, our captain took the shift up there and we went through and walked through the whole thing to kind of get a more of a perspective of how things were. It was just terrible. So they decided to go ahead and tear it down.
And yet, in the years since the tragedy, residents have always held on to their firm belief in Nebraskan hospitality.
Everybody looks out for everybody else. When there's any kind of a crisis, we've all stayed close, pulled together.
You know, 40 years later, it's still like it was yesterday. It's just, you remember everything. You know, and all the years of covering things, you have to remember the people that perish. And I'm glad there's memorials up now.
Since the dawn of engineering, humans have tried to tame the forces of Mother Nature. But sometimes, the elements fight back. Like this disaster in Tennessee, as floodwaters took out a vital highway.
I looked at my partner and just said, the bridge is gone.
A catastrophe that devastated a community.
It was worse than I'd ever thought.
And left scars that linger to this day.
Even years later, you'd have an eerie feeling. How did it happen?
Tennessee, a state with a story that's been shaped by its most famous waterway, the wild Mississippi River.
The Mississippi River is massive, pouring almost 17 million liters of water into the Gulf of Mexico every second, all thanks to around 250 tributaries that gather water from 32 states and 2 Canadian provinces.
One of those tributaries is the Hatchie River, which flows across western Tennessee. J.T. Poncho Chumley is a retired local sheriff.
Whenever you get onto the river, instead of just one straight channel, the river has so many bends and turns in it. It's a good river as long as you respect it like any river.
And that respect is due wherever the river and engineering meet. Like here in Tipton County, where US 51 crosses the Hatchie. Jeff Huffman is the county executive.
US 51 is a major 4-lane highway that connects all of West Tennessee to the Memphis area and then below Memphis into Mississippi.
US 51 is a vital highway and stretches more than 2,000 kilometers from New Orleans almost to the Great Lakes. In Tennessee, more than 20,000 vehicles use it every day.
Today, these twin spans carry all that traffic over the Hatchie. But up until the 1970s, just one old bridge crossed the sprawling floodplain here. Paul Deggs is chief engineer for Tennessee's Department of Transportation.
West Tennessee, it's swampy type area and very, very wide floodplains, and the bridge consisted of a main span over the river and then a series of shorter spans on the very, very wide floodplain.
In total, the bridge had 143 individual spans. Most were simple beam designs on top of concrete columns, with one steel truss span where it crossed the main channel.
Beam or simple span bridges are essentially a concrete and steel version of a log over a stream. And in the 1930s, they were one of the most efficient ways to build a long structure like this.
The old, simple design of the bridge kept Tennessee connected for 4 decades. But by the 1970s, it was struggling to keep up with the times.
The population of Tennessee had grown. A parallel bridge was built to the old bridge. So one bridge carried traffic in the northbound direction, and then the other bridge carried the traffic in the southbound direction.
For over 10 years, the old and the new bridges stood together, keeping traffic flowing smoothly over the Hatchie. But their shared success was about to come to a dramatic end. Saturday, April the 1st, 1989. West Tennessee was hit with a once-in-a-decade storm, causing the Hatchie River to flood. At the time, Howard Jerry was an emergency medical technician.
I was on duty that day at the hospital for the ambulance service, and it was becoming late in the evening, and the call came in.
A vehicle had gone off the bridge.
We immediately responded.
Pancho Chumley, who went on to be local sheriff, was early in his career when he too responded.
At the time I was 21 years old, very young deputy, just getting started. I was monitoring the radio and I heard one of the big truckers, and he was in distress. And you could tell that in his voice something was wrong.
In the pitch black night, the true scale of the damage slowly became clear.
When we got up here, we looked over to the northbound bridge, and I said to my partner, I told him, I said, there's not a vehicle off the bridge is gone.
This is about where the bridge started, the old bridge. I thought the whole bridge is out. And that's the first thing that I remember.
And that's when we realized what we were really up against.
3 spans of the old bridge had dropped into the floodwaters. But that wasn't all. 5 vehicles had driven into the void.
This is something that we had not seen before. A section of the bridge being gone, but then realizing that people were under it.
Never dreamed of coming up on anything like that. It was just, it was catastrophic.
First responders scoured the wreckage for survivors. But the news wasn't good.
When we climbed down, we looked and we could see 3 patients in the first car. And we knew at that point in time that they had fatal injuries.
We didn't find any activity other than the whole slab down, and we didn't see any survivors.
By daybreak, it was clear the rescue mission was over. Tragically, the collapse had claimed the lives of all 8 people in the fallen vehicles.
You know, you could tell this is going to be more of a recovery than a rescue.
While the recovery team cleared the wreckage from the old bridge, investigators arrived on the scene.
The new bridge had made it through the flood completely unscathed. So the obvious question was, what was different about the old bridge?
The answer lay in the design. Paul Deggs from Tennessee's Department of Transportation explains.
One of the big differences between the 2 bridges, with the new bridge, we had a continuous concrete deck to where if something moved on one span, the other span pulled back in the other direction. The old bridge consisted of what we call simple spans, in that from pier to pier, the spans were not connected.
But simple span bridges like this are found across the world and don't suffer the same fate. Here, there was an additional factor in play. Years of human intervention that changed the natural course of the river, and in this case, proved fatal.
When a lot of the agricultural activity and the flood reduction strategies, they would take a crooked stream and pull it straight. And what happens when you do that is it puts the stream mechanics in a state of flux.
Rivers are dynamic. They flood, they dry up, they change course. But if humans intervene, for example, straightening a section, it can trigger unforeseen consequences downstream.
The decades of management had caused the river to change course at the worst possible location, on the curve just upstream from the bridge.
In the case of the Hatchie River, it moved about 80 feet from when the original bridge was built around 1930 to when the Hatchie River Bridge collapsed in 1989.
As the river gradually changed course, its waters began to erode the ground around piers that were originally built on the floodplain, leaving them exposed to the fast-flowing river.
So when you have a pier in the water flows past that pier, and as the water hits it, it will churn the soil up around it, and that churning will dig. And if the scour is deep enough, if the water is flowing fast enough, pretty soon you will have an unsupported pile.
With the ground around the piers already weakened by scour, the additional force of the flood caused total failure, bringing 3 spans down into the water below.
The bridge failed because ultimately, as the river moved over time, the bridge was not designed to account for the channel going under the bridge where it was actually going under.
It's still unbelievable that the whole center of the bridge fell out.
It was clear that repairing the old bridge wasn't a safe option. So traffic on US 51 shared the 1970s crossing.
I know we were out for at least 2 weeks doing different rotations, diverting traffic up to north and south on the bridge.
Meanwhile, engineers were hard at work replacing the fallen bridge.
Ultimately, we switched traffic to the new bridge, tore the old bridge down, and rebuilt a new bridge in its place.
Key to the new bridge's survival was a clever system that would keep the flow of the wild Hatchie in check as it passed under the bridge.
We built a series of guide banks out of limestone rock that we hauled into the area. They look like fingers that stick out into the river, and as water goes past them, it creates eddies that slow the water down and drop soil out on the outside bank of the river, and then the water flows through and heads on toward the Mississippi.
New rules were also put in place across the state, ensuring engineers regularly inspect bridge foundations for the warning signs of excess erosion.
After this collapse, they really took a look at bridges and developed a program for inspection to make sure that this kind of thing wouldn't happen again.
Big engineering isn't over once the construction crews leave the site. Any weakness in day-to-day operations can lead to catastrophe. Like this disaster in Quebec, as explosions ripped through a lakeside town.
I saw the sky become all red. Old people saw the town burning. It was hell.
The tragedy nearly wiped a city from the map.
La zone qui a été détruite ici, là, qui représente à peu près la moitié du centre-ville.
And revealed a weakness in a crucial rail safety system.
This was one of the worst rail disasters in Canadian history.
The city of Lac-Mégantic was founded in the 1880s, near Quebec's border with the US state of Maine. Nestled in rolling hills, this lakeshore town is a popular tourist destination. Gilles Flouet grew up here.
C'est un endroit pour les gens qui aiment vivre le plein air. C'est pas une zone urbaine très urbanisée, c'est plutôt campagnard, mais c'est des beaux paysages.
The only thing that disturbs the peace here is the railroad cutting through downtown.
In the 1880s, the transcontinental railroad system connected Canada from coast to coast, and towns like Lac-Mégantic were built beside the tracks to help keep the trains running.
By the 21st century, this was a key route for freight coming from the Canadian and US interiors, bound for Atlantic seaports.
More than 4 million tons of freight pass through the town each year, on trains carrying everything from timber to crude oil.
For decades, trains would stop for scheduled overnight breaks in the scenic hills, around 11 kilometers from Lac-Mégantic. Diego Ramirez Cardona is a professor of engineering.
C'était un endroit couramment utilisé pour garer les trains des marchandises. Les conducteurs étaient habitués à dormir à Lac-Mégantic pour reprendre le lendemain.
The rest stop is on a slope, so reliable braking systems are key to holding thousands of tons of train and crude oil tankers in place.
Ces types de trains ont deux types de freins différents. Il y a les freins automatiques qui servent à réduire la vitesse du train et à l'arrêter. Et ensuite, il y a des freins indépendants qui servent à maintenir les trains en stationnement.
Both the automatic and independent systems work using air brakes.
Air brakes rely on massive air pressure from a compressor to force the brake pads onto the wheels, holding the train still. But crucially, the compressor only works when the engine is running.
For longer stops, each wagon can be held in place by manually operated mechanical handbrakes.
This combined braking method had been used for decades, but in 2013, the system would be called into question. Friday, July the 5th. Gilles Flouet was out in downtown Lac-Mégantic.
Ce soir-là, moi, j'ai pris une marche en ville comme je prends la plupart du temps, à peu près tous les soirs. Je suis arrivé au Musicafé, où il y avait des chansonniers, là, puis il y avait une soirée agréable. J'ai passé la soirée là, puis vers minuit et demi, mon intuition me disait qu'il fallait que je parte.
Gilles' intuition was about to save his life. As he walked home, he saw a train loaded with oil hurtle into town.
C'était des wagons, citernes, noirs, qui dévalaient à 105 km/h.
The train had more than 70 cars full of oil and weighed over 10,000 tons.
J'ai vite réalisé que c'était pas normal parce qu'il n'y avait pas de lumière sur le train, il n'y avait pas de frein qui grinçait.
As Gilles looked on, the train took a corner so fast that it derailed. Diane Roy was woken by a call.
The phone rang, and it was my mother. She was living just in front here of the train crash. She thought it was thunder or something like that.
63 of the tanker cars had crashed, spilling more than 6 million litres of crude across the town centre, which then caught fire. First responders arrived in minutes, as Diane's mother fled the scene just in time.
And then the explosion happened. I saw the sky become all red. It was hell.
More explosions rang out. Turning the sky into a boiling mass of flames and smoke.
J'étais au bord de la voie ferrée. J'ai vu comment ça s'était passé.
As firefighters tackled the blaze, 2,000 residents were evacuated from their homes. The flames burned for 2 days, and fire crews spent another 2 days dousing the hot, smouldering wreckage.
There were airplanes or helicopters flying. We cannot describe what we were feeling.
The town centre was decimated. Nearly 40 buildings were reduced to ruin, some with people inside, including the bar where Gilles had spent the evening.
Je connaissais tous les gens qu'il y avait dans le Musicafé, dans le bloc aux côtés, puis partout au centre-ville. Tous les gens qui sont morts, c'était du monde que je connaissais intimement.
The tragedy devastated the small community. In total, 47 people lost their lives, making this one of the worst rail disasters in Canadian history.
Because we're a little town, we lost some friends, many friends.
The community was in shock and demanding answers.
I was angry that that could happen because people saw their town burning.
Within days, engineers arrived on site to investigate just what had caused this catastrophe. They knew that hours before the disaster, the train had been parked uphill from the town when fire broke out on the lead locomotive.
Investigators found a black, oily residue on the rails where the lead locomotive had been parked. It was evidence of an oil leak, which had caught fire late that night.
It was standard protocol to leave the locomotive's engine running during stopovers. Here, the heat combined with an oil leak explained the initial blaze. But the real problems began when firefighters were forced to shut down the engine. Professor of Engineering Diego Ramirez Cardona knows the case.
Les pompiers sont arrivés et pour maîtriser les feux, ils ont dû couper l'alimentation de cette locomotrice-là parce que c'était le carburant qui alimentait la locomotrice qui était en train aussi d'alimenter le feu.
With the flames doused, firefighters left the scene. But turning off the engine to put out the fire had also stopped the air brake compressors.
Ils n'ont pas vu le problème automatiquement parce que la pression dans le système de frein descend petit à petit. Donc, une fois que tout le monde était parti du site, la pression est descendue à un niveau tellement bas qu'il n'y avait plus d'action de freinage sur les roues.
As well as the compressed air brakes, 7 of the tanker cars had manual handbrakes applied, which would still have functioned properly without power. But with the primary air brake system disabled, it wasn't enough to prevent the train and tanker cars from careering downhill into Lac Mégantic.
Dans les conditions où on se trouvait, c'était un train qui était très lourd et en plus il était en pente. Il aurait fallu d'activer beaucoup de freins à main pour que ça puisse être retenu.
As the train rolled uncontrollably into downtown Lac Mégantic, it derailed, rupturing the tank cars, allowing oil to gush out, which then triggered the massive inferno and explosions. The Transportation Safety Board of Canada took just over a month to release their report, and regulations were changed not only in Canada, but across North America.
These days, there always has to be someone on board to monitor the train, and tank cars are being replaced with a design that's more resistant to rupturing in a derailment. It's all aimed at preventing a disaster like this from happening again.
And there's one big change coming that will forever guarantee Lac Mégantic's safety. A new rail line that will completely bypass the town.
One key lesson from this disaster is that safety-critical systems should always have a foolproof backup plan in place.
With big engineering, every stage of the project matters, from design to execution. Any change in plan, no matter how small, can grow into a big problem. Like this catastrophe in Australia, when a happy holiday season turned into chaos for residents at a landmark tower.
People who were inside heard loud bangs, and a lot of people thought they were bombs.
A mass evacuation turned high-rise dreams into nightmares.
It just felt surreal. It was very overwhelming. It didn't feel possible that could happen in this city.
People were preparing for celebration, but they were left with heartbreak.
Sydney, Australia is known for its iconic skyline, from the unique Opera House to the famous Harbour Bridge. The city's long been a hotspot for people looking to break into the housing market. And in the late 2010s, as news reporter Lizzie Pearl explains, demand was outstripping supply.
There is a saying in Australia, it's the great Australian dream to own your own home. A lot of people, a lot of young investors or young families really felt like they were going to miss out, and that's what created this frenetic energy and this desperation to buy apartments.
And this striking tower at Sydney's former Olympic Park would be at the top of every prospective owner's wish list.
The triangular tower wasn't just striking to look at, it would give residents an equally stunning view, whether it was across the Olympic Park or towards Sydney Harbour.
The 36-storey tower's triangular footprint wasn't the only standout feature. It also had multiple recessed garden balconies on each side. On its opening in August 2018, the tower seemed to have it all and would prove immediately popular.
People really wanted to buy an apartment like this. Well, it was perfect because it's a great investment. It's close to transport, it's close to schools, it's close to where you work, and that made this a really attractive buy.
For the first few months, everything seemed to be going well. But as the 2018 holiday season approached, residents were in store for an unwelcome Christmas surprise. December 24th. Residents of the 36-storey tower were settling into their Christmas Eve celebrations.
A beautiful summer's day here in Sydney. In the afternoon, there would have been prawns in the fridge, white wine chilling, families getting ready for parties.
At the base of the tower, Nash Kent's bike shop was buzzing.
There was a lot of people in the shop. There was families in getting their bikes for their kids for Christmas. Our mechanics were working away, furiously trying to hit all the Christmas Eve deadlines.
But celebrations were short-lived, when a loud boom echoed through the building.
It was probably late morning when I first heard sirens and noticed a couple of police officers talking to a lady in the car park. I just assumed there might have been a small accident down there or something.
But this wasn't a small accident. Tower residents had reported what sounded like an explosion.
People who were inside heard loud bangs, and a lot of people thought they were bombs.
Emergency services weren't taking any chances and ordered an immediate evacuation.
A couple more police officers came in. They told us to evacuate, and they just said, guys, get out now. The building is in jeopardy.
It's just that uncertainty and that fear that perhaps, their building was under attack.
Despite the chaos and confusion, it became clear this wasn't a bomb threat. But something else had people scared. Residents from the 10th floor had seen major damage to the walls of the recessed garden balconies.
So first we hear the sound, then people reported seeing big cracks in the walls, in the floor, up on level 10.
No one knew how bad the damage was, or if the tower itself was in danger.
The crowd was gradually moved out 50 metres at a time just to get further and further away from the building.
Surrounding buildings were evacuated and roads closed.
There was an exclusion zone as far as we can see around here, because I guess the real fear was if this building is going to go down, it's going to take out the neighbouring buildings. So a lot of chaos, a lot of confusion.
On Christmas Eve, it just felt surreal. It was very overwhelming. It didn't feel possible that could happen in this city with this type of building these days. We realised that we weren't getting back in and we could potentially be out for a while.
With cracks in the structure and no idea of the cause, authorities closed the building indefinitely. As residents moved to alternative accommodation, they quickly began demanding answers.
The question really was, this is a brand new building. It's less than 6 months old. People were asking, how could this happen?
Investigators first focused on the initial reports of cracks on the 10th floor.
There were cracks found on level 10, which was sort of a kind of a fancy garden area, and these cracks were massive.
Examining other levels for damage, cracks were found in almost identical locations in other iconic garden spaces. The walls were made from a stack of concrete panels, supported from below by what's known as hob beams, sitting on 4 columns. These beams are designed to withstand a huge amount of pressure from above. But this one had cracked explosively and explained the loud bangs that residents had heard.
There were cement beams that had crumbled, so that's when they knew that something was really wrong.
Investigators concluded that the hob beam had been overloaded. The question was why? For unknown reasons, where the wall panels sat on the beam below, up to half of the grout that should have filled the joints was missing.
Grouting is widespread in concrete engineering, where load-bearing members join. It helps them carry the forces from above down to the ground, working together like one solid structure.
With limited grouting, the result was an uneven loading of the hob beam. But the damage didn't become evident until people started moving in. The residents may have been the trigger. As the weight of people and their belongings increased, the loading from above also increased. With the pressure unevenly spread, on Christmas Eve the hob beam cracked, with a deafening boom.
Although the damage was shocking, authorities found that the evacuated building was at no risk of actual collapse, and until a solution was found, temporary shoring props were used to support the damaged beams.
The discovery of the cause was of small comfort to residents, because fully fixing the tower was forecast to take months. Nash was lucky. On the ground floor, he was allowed to return and reopen his business just 2 weeks later.
On about the 7th or 8th of January 2019, we could come back in and trade with some of our space occupied.
Back up in the tower, construction crews got to work on the fix.
The solution was relatively straightforward: to fit steel braces on either side of the hob beams, as well as adding extra grouting wherever it was missing. But it wouldn't come cheap.
So it was a pretty expensive repair job, $26 million to fix all of those defects and all of those cracks. A further $10 million was spent on temporary accommodation.
Although the fix worked, the building was almost brand new when the failures happened. So it was crucial that lessons were learned across the construction industry.
So as a result of what happened here, the New South Wales government really had to act fast and introduce a lot of reforms to the industry, not only to prevent a future disaster from happening, but also to restore confidence.
The authorities established the Building Structure Review Board to investigate structural problems in new buildings, to uncover the causes, and to recommend any regulatory changes that might help to prevent them from happening again.
Nearly 12 months later, the cracks that had ruined the previous Christmas were fully fixed, and the relieved residents were able to safely return to their homes.
And a couple of years later, it appears that it's back full again and back to normal.